Oh, yes. Sorry. There. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Dudley Althouse. I'm a correspondent here with the Wall Street Journal based here in Mexico City. I'm sort of pinch hitting as moderator here, but I've been to Cuba 4 times since last August, and I've seen a lot of changes. I hadn't been in since 2006. I'd like to present Janet Kim, who is a partner at Baker McKenzie's Washington office and is the head of the North American trade practice, and Rachel DeLevy-Ore, who is the assistant director of the Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council. Janet is an expert on sanctions and sanctions compliance. And so the question I have for Janet is, the Obama administration has been really cutting deeply into the Cuba embargo. Some of us have been surprised by it, especially from what my understanding is that the embargo forbids U.S. companies to do any business in Cuba that would benefit economically the Cuban government. Yet you have hotel companies, you have other investors going in that the Cuban government owns all the hotels, either majority owned or outright owns all of them. Carnival Cruise Line just went in 2 weeks ago. It's going in again next week. They have to pay docking fees. You can't do business in Cuba without benefiting the Cuban government. So if you can just explain to us a little bit, what is exactly the bottom line on the various portions of the U.S. embargo of Cuba?
Sure. And I can answer your specific question about is there some prohibition on benefiting the government of Cuba right away, and then let me step back and sort of let's take a look after about a year, because we did this a year ago in Houston, and the things that I said a year ago I probably wouldn't say, in fact I won't be saying today. So on the issue of benefiting the Cuban government, that was sort of the old way of thinking, I would say, prior to these more recent changes over the last 18 months. And the reality is that the Cuban government is so inextricably connected to even the private entrepreneurial workings of the government that my guess is that the U.S. government has realized that that's not a realistic position to take. So with some more recent rule changes, they have said, look, it's not a problem if the Cuban government is involved, get some fees that are sort of the normal government fees. But the overall purpose of the government project needs to be to benefit the Cuban people. So if you're able to make that kind of an argument to the U.S. government, you either qualify for pre-approval or you can get approval on that basis. So that needs to be the sort of basis of your argument. But going back to, and this is touching on a comment you just made about the Obama administration seems to be cutting deep. A year ago, and I don't think any of you were there except for people from Baker and McKenzie, what I had said was that I thought the Obama administration had probably gone about as far as it could go in terms of relaxing the sanctions, that anything further would require an act of Congress, because this is a space that's sort of jealously occupied by both, in the American system, the executive branch and then the legislative branch. And I have been proven wrong. The Obama administration has gone further at least twice. And I feel a little more liberated because I'm not on U.S. soil. I think what may be happening is, as I watch this, and I see this happening with the Iran sanctions as well, which, as you all know, have been significantly relaxed, I feel like from a policy perspective, they're saying, let's just push as far as we can and as hard as we can on the Obama administration. And if Congress has a problem with it, they'll say something or they'll do something. And that has happened on the Iranian side. And so far, touch wood, hasn't happened on the Cuban side. And so that's why I think you're seeing the news about more sort of aggressive types of economic activities from the perspective of U.S. companies in Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, a Miami law firm just won the right from the U.S. government for Orvis, the outdoor outfitters, to run fishing excursions into Cuba. Instead of people-to-people tours, they're going to be people-to-fish tours. And I mean, it just seems like, they're going to push this as far as they can. The Cubans are pushing back. Rachel. I mean, the party Congress was very hardline. The reaction was pretty severe. Fidel Castro's reaction to the Obama visit was it was a screed. It was very angry. What do you see happening in Cuba as far as pushback? And also in the United States, you cover this in the Congress, the U.S. Congress. Do you see the next Congress after the next election, maybe doing away with the embargo altogether? Is that a possibility?
So I think that the pushback that we're seeing on the Cuban side means that the U.S. is doing something right. And it means that we're making progress in a way that's important, not just for the bilateral relationship, but for the relationship for the U.S. and the rest of Latin America. This is a politically wise decision. As far as what we can expect to see from the U.S., the embargo is really a misnomer because it's not just one thing. It's this whole web of sanctions that's been established over 50 some odd years. And so, no, I don't think we're going to see that lifted overnight under any sort of Congress, under any sort of president. But I do think that we could see sort of continually, the Obama administration has made allowances for certain kinds of trade, certain kinds of travel. We could see that come from Congress as well. And I think that there's just sort of a fatigue when it comes to Cuba, and that there's just not really a willingness, like Janet was mentioning, to fight back on this. And so these allowances are just not going to get the kind of pushback that they used to.
Okay. And Janet, reparations is a big stumbling block for totally doing away with the embargo, the various sanctions. Where does that stand? What are the reparations negotiations? Where does that stand exactly?
So reparations, I mentioned that the Congress has gotten involved in sort of administering or setting the boundaries of the U.S. embargo against Cuba. And one of the requirements that's in the law for a relaxation or a lifting of sanctions is that neither of the Castro brothers can be in power. I mean, it's very, very specific. On the reparations issue, they don't go quite that far, but they go pretty close. And I think it's reparations are a major issue that have to be settled before anything serious could happen on the U.S. side. There has been, according to the press reports, one set of discussions between the Cubans and the U.S. on reparations, the expropriation of property in Cuba, dating back to 1959. That actually just covers the companies that were U.S. companies and claimants at the time. It does not, for example, cover the hundreds of Cuban Americans who were Cubans at the time their property was taken and have since immigrated to the United States. That's another big pool of potential claimants. And according to some observers, the U.S. government said, all right, we have adjudicated ourselves, without the Cubans involved, adjudicated certified claims valued at close to $2 billion, but with interest, you're up about $7 billion. And I believe the Cuban rejoinder to the government rejoinder was, well, let's talk about reparations that you all owe to us because the damages that we have suffered because of the U.S. embargo. So apparently it was a very short meeting, and it ended. So that was the first one. I think our clients are asking about, are there lessons to be learned from other sort of claims settlement processes in other countries? So the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal is a good example, and there were lots of differences. I mean, the first one is there was a gob of money for on the Iranian claims side. The other is there is an actual tribunal that is got representatives from Iran, the U.S., and the more neutral representatives. And we have neither of those really on the Cuban side. You've got, the value of the claims with interest is anywhere from 7 to 8 billion in an economy with a GDP of about 70 billion. So you do the math, all right? It's not realistic to expect a full dollar return. And the U.S. has frozen some Cuban property, but in the last I checked, was a 2014 report. It's valued at about 270 million. That's pretty modest. So the thought, some companies are saying, look, in the Iranian claims process, what some claimants did was agree to settle with the Iranians and sort of get what Rachel refers to as the first bite at the apple, if or when the law permits it. And I think that some U.S. claimants are considering that approach vis-a-vis the Cubans. It's not a perfect match because they're not in the discussions between the U.S. and the Cuban government, but it's definitely something that I think their perception is the Cuban government has that in mind as they talk to them.
But corporations are the main amount of claims are with U.S. corporations and dollar value, yes.
Sure.
And they're more liable to settle for the first bite of the apple and that sort of thing.
Right, and probably are not realistically expecting to get anywhere near the full value. I mean, we handle lots of mergers and acquisitions where companies are acquiring others, and before they used to just say, oh yes, this target company has a certified claim, it's worth nothing, right? And they just worried about the legal hurdles they have to satisfy because they're buying a company that has that claim. I've had a couple of companies say, we're looking at a U.S. target, they have a certified claim, is it worth something? How do we value it?
Right.
Or is it more valuable to us because we can use this as a bargaining chip with the Cubans if and when we can finally go in?
Okay. Any questions from the audience? We have a few minutes. Yes, sir. Can we get a microphone for him? Sorry. Oh, right there, the man standing right here.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
Thanks. Janet, you might have been wrong by a degree last year, but not wrong in principle, it seems to me. I mean, the underlying purpose of the change in U.S. policy was to try a different approach to still achieve the changes that the U.S. government has been looking for over the years. And I guess the question is, what is the prospect of change within Cuba? Have we noticed any as we've talked a lot about the U.S. embargo, the changes, what's now possible. What are the changes that have taken place in Cuba, if any, and what is the prospect for future change in Cuba? Because that's ultimately, I think, what will make room for, make possible major change.
So I think the changes that we've seen in Cuba under Raul are not to be ignored. They may be minor in the scheme of what Cuba needs to do, but they've been important because there has been a certain opening, there has been a certain economic reform, there has been movement to open up a very small, limited, but still, for the first time, there is a small private sector in Cuba. And so that type of reform, continuing that kind of movement is going to be important. I actually think that we may see that best under Raul. And so this idea of neither of the Castros being in power, being where the big change is going to come from, I think that that may not be the right thing. I think the other big change that we'll see in Cuba is when the country gains access to the international financial institutions, because they desperately need help on that front, from unifying their currency to cleaning up their books to making more transparent systems in order to make themselves more attractive to foreign investment. Those are the major changes that we're going to need to see in Cuba for the sake of Cuba.
What I was just working on when I was in Cuba a few weeks ago is tourism. I think both governments are really betting on tourism to be the engine going forward for the coming years. I don't know if Janet agrees, but the Cuban government's betting that they can get more and more revenue from tourism, sparked by the rush of U.S. citizens and residents going into Cuba, but they're only at 10% of the tourism so far. The Obama administration, I think, is expecting them to pour money into this emerging private sector. The number of private restaurants in Cuba have, since 2011, have gone from 113, most of them in Havana, to 1,600. And these restaurants are really popular, and people are just pouring money into them. They're expensive, too. They're world-class restaurants, world-class prices. Bed and breakfast has just exploded, and mostly in Havana, but also in the other cities. The nature of the tourism is changing. The Canadian and European tourists mostly went to the beach resorts, and they very isolated, very removed from the Cuban population. Now everybody wants to rush into Havana before it changes, and they're having a lot more interaction with Cuban people, a lot more. And I think that the bet, and what I would see, I think it's probably a good bet, is that is going to have more of an effect on a push for change inside Cuba. So it's, God knows, it's going to take years. One professor I talked to, the best line of my time there this last time was, if you have 5 Cubans together in a room, there's 6 policemen among them. So I mean, people are very self-repressed, very cautious. The Cubans I talk to don't really feel, even though they're making a lot of money, taxi drivers, the average income for a state worker is $2,400. $24 a month. The lowest price on the Carnival cruise going into Cuba is worth 10 years' salary for a Cuban state employee. The lowest price for an interior cabin. So the taxi drivers, going back and forth from Vedado, the hotel district, down to downtown Havana, can cost you 10 Cuban dollars or 10 kooks. A taxi driver in a night can make, say, 10 times what a Cuban state employee makes. That has to have some impact. But if you talk to the taxi drivers, and I did, they are very frustrated. They don't see the change. Everybody's very frustrated. People are still coming out of Cuba any way they can. They don't think it's changing fast enough. But indeed, when you go back, as I did after 9 years when I first went back last August, tremendous change. You feel a lot less repression, a lot less. The security apparatus is still there, but it's not so obvious. It's just, and the commerce and just the liveliness of the city of Havana. But how long that's going to take, I don't know. So anyhow, just my impressions. Any other questions, please? Yes, sir.
Just very quickly to follow up to that, as a result of some of the as a result of some of the lessening of the restrictions, and we haven't really discussed the human rights record of Cuba going forward, and will it remain a problem as long as the Castros are there? But is there a possibility of almost a wave of people leaving Cuba, given the lifting of some restrictions? So we've talked a lot about investments going in, but is there a realistic possibility that you may see some of those taxi drivers who could probably pitch in the major leagues or be doctors leaving to pursue a better life? Because there's certainly more contact with their relatives in Miami and elsewhere, and they know those opportunities exist.
I think we're actually seeing some of that wave happen out of nervousness right now, before things continue to change, because there's a nervousness that the wet foot, dry foot, or the very favorable immigration policy for Cubans coming to the U.S. Will change, and so we're already seeing this influx, and certainly, the movement of people will become more liberalized. But I think that there is also, as there are in so many countries, a sort of national pride, and people want to have opportunities to be able to stay in their country. And so I think maybe you will have the taxi drivers leaving to look for another life, but you may have more of your doctors looking to stay in Cuba, because now that is a viable career path where they can earn a real living, doing that in their home country in a way that they couldn't before.
I interviewed people coming through Central America, Cubans coming through Central America last fall, and a lot of their motivation, they're angry that it's not changing fast enough. But I think what a lot of their motivation is, if you can get to the United States within a year you get a green card, I believe, and once you have the green card, you can go back to Cuba. So you can make dollars in the United States, and you can go back to Cuba. You can send money back to Cuba. They want to get in before the door is shut on wet foot, dry foot, I think. There was just a group airlifted to, they're flying them from Panama right now to Ciudad Juarez up at El Paso, whereas Central Americans are having to walk, ride the train. So it's an inherently unfair thing. It's a relic of the Cold War, but it's still going on. I don't know when they'll drop it. So.
Well, and that is one thing, and I thought we would get through this panel without mentioning Donald Trump, but and I'm shocked that I'm the one bringing him up, but a lot of clients have asked us, well, what could change with the Cuban policy if Trump becomes president? And interestingly, on the embargo, he's been remarkably consistent. He's okay with the direction this is taking, but he's criticized Obama, saying, I would have gotten a better deal for the U.S. than Obama did. But on the immigration point, he is opposed to the wet foot, dry foot law. So it looks like, and of course this is what he said the last time, but that he would change that. And he's been pretty consistent on that as well. So.
Oh, good point. Yes, Peter.
Peter Schechter. There's one question that I ask everybody, every panel that I hear on Cuba, which is, does the lifting of the sanctions by the U.S. Congress, would it make a whit of difference today, if it happened today? I understand that everybody seems very excited, but will businesses really go into Cuba, even if sanctions were lifted?
I'll give you the lawyer's answer to that, and I think there are different perspectives here that are, there are a gazillion non-U.S. companies that have been able to go into Cuba, and for whatever reason haven't, either for commercial reasons or because the Cubans have sort of been holding them at arm's length. So the lifting of the U.S. sanctions would just put the U.S. companies on the same footing, in my view, as those other Europeans. I mean, look, Canada and Mexico are huge investors in Cuba. But there's not also been this enormous influx into Cuba as there was, say, to Vietnam, all right? So from where I sit, I sort of feel like it's a two-way street, and lifting on the U.S. side doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a Cuba saying, come in and welcoming them with open arms, which has been the case with the rest of the world, all right? It's not just confined to the U.S.
You know, I think, would it make a difference? I think politically, yes, it would look very good for the United States to end this relic of the old war, the Cold War. But economically, I'm a major skeptic on this front. I think that this is a country of 11 million people who make $25 a month. There's very poor infrastructure. Electricity costs, I believe, are 15 times what they are in the US. And there's no legal assurances. The Cuban government can still show up and seize your factory, ask the Bacardi family. You know, this is not necessarily an enticing business opportunity, whether or not you're allowed to. I think there's a lot of excitement over this in the U.S. right now, and I think most of that stems from the sort of forbidden fruit nature of it. My major caveat to this is the tourism community, because that will be money that doesn't come from Cuba and doesn't come from Cubans. And so when it comes to the hospitality industry, when it comes to Carnival, I think that there are serious opportunities for the tourism industry outside of that. I think that we can look to our European and Canadian and Mexican allies who have been allowed to operate in Cuba and still don't have major operations there for a host of very good reasons outside of any sort of legal embargo.
I just talked to investors that were there for a tourism trade fair, basically, U.S. investors, and they're looking at marinas and that sort of thing. But one guy who's been at this for quite a while said this is a long-term project. It takes you months just to get to the right person to talk to, whatever your pitch is going to be. And the Cubans, the Canadians know pretty well. They rushed into Cuba in the 90s. A lot of investors went into mining, went into a lot of different things. They went into joint ventures with the Cuban government, and a lot of them got basically shoved out again. And then several Canadian business people were actually jailed on trumped up, they say trumped up charges of corruption and everything else, that had operated in the country for 20 years and then were jailed. The Cuban government can run hot and cold on this. So again, it probably has to wait, in my opinion, until the Castro brothers are off the stage, and then maybe some changes in the Cuban regime. Yes, one more.
In a lot of Spanish companies investing in Cuba, and how is the relationship right now with Spain?
Would you like? Meliá, the Spanish hotel chain, is the largest investor, I think, in Cuba right now. They run a lot of the hotels for the Cuban government, and they're in joint ventures, from what I understand, in some of the hotels. The Cuban military has the largest number of hotels in Cuba. They have something like 25,000 rooms out of 64,000. The tourism ministry has a larger number of rooms, but it's split up between a number of companies. The Cuban military owns all their hotels outright. They're going to build They say they're going to build 50,000 more hotel rooms in the next 4 years, which is, people think that's not really possible, but that's what they say. They're going to own everything outright, and then they're going to have some top grade hotel operators run the hotels for them. So, and the Spanish and others. So, I think that tourism is definitely going to be the push going forward. And I'm not sure it's a good bet, actually, because everybody now wants to see Cuba. The fact the Americans are rushing in, I was told that the French airlines are going to increase more than double their flights this coming winter season. So the French, the Europeans are afraid the Americans are going to ruin Cuba. And one of the hotel operators, a French hotel operator, told me that as the American tourists rise, the Canadian tourists are going to drop because they don't want to be in the same place with the Americans. So we'll see how that works out. I think that's enough. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. This is my turn just to give the final remarks. We really thank you, everybody, for your attendance, your patience. It has been a long morning, but with very interesting topics. We really thank you, our business partner, Atlantic Council, which, of course, Peter, this cannot happen without your participation and the rest of the team. So thank you very much. To all our staff, the Karens, Consuelo, everybody in the team, thank you very much. It was a wonderful event. When Miguel called me and say, well, we have the opportunity to be in Mexico to host the North American Commercial Group and also to have this event, I said, well, this is a great idea. This is something that we have to do more often. But now that this happened, I truly believe that this is something that we have to do at least once a year. We benefit from the opinion of different panelists. Of course, we have Madame Secretary Ruiz Massieu. She expressed the opinion where Mexico is, how we see our future in terms of the international trade. We heard about the trends on international trades and everything. We heard about autonomous car, the idea of that law firms with slim. I stay with the car idea better, and the discussion of the U.S. election, which was very interesting, and this is something that reflects that the attention is not only in the U.S. We are part of the Americas. We see how globalization is impacting. So this is something that will show that we are talking about the Americas now, not only North America. And this is something that we should continue paying attention. I really thank you, everybody that is here. Without you, our clients, our friends, our colleagues, this may not happen. So thank you again very much for all your attention.